The screaming stopped at exactly 11:47 p.m. on October 13, 1879, but the silence that followed was far worse than any sound Thaddeus Jefferson had ever heard. Outside the weathered clapboard house in rural Kentucky, autumn wind rattled bare branches like skeletal fingers, while inside, the acrid smell of carbolic acid mixed with something else, something that made even the experienced physician's stomach turn. What Jefferson witnessed that night would challenge everything science believed possible about human anatomy, consciousness, and the very nature of life itself. The call had come through the local telegraph office 3 hours earlier. Medical emergency. Urgent assistance required. Strange circumstances. Jefferson, one of only 2 qualified physicians within 50 miles of the remote farming community of Ashworth's Hollow, had hitched his horse and ridden hard through the October darkness. The message came from Clement Bancroft, the town's part-time constable and full-time blacksmith, a man known for his steady nerves and practical nature. If Bancroft was calling for help, something truly extraordinary was happening. The house belonged to Tabitha Parker, a widow who lived alone with her 14-year-old daughter, Tabitha. Neighbors described them as quiet, devout, and unremarkable. Fidelia worked as a seamstress, taking in mending from the more prosperous families in the county seat. Tabitha helped with household chores and was known for her skill with numbers, an unusual talent for a girl in that time and place, but not unheard of. Jefferson's medical bag felt heavier than usual as he approached the front door. Through the windows, he could see the warm glow of oil lamps, but something about the quality of the light seemed wrong. It flickered and shifted in patterns that defied the steady flames he could observe directly. "Dr. Jefferson, thank God you've come." Clement Bancroft met him at the threshold, his usually ruddy face pale as parchment. Behind him stood Harland Elliott, the local pastor, clutching a worn Bible against his chest like a shield. Both men's eyes held the haunted look of those who had witnessed something that challenged their understanding of the world. "What exactly am I dealing with here?" Jefferson asked, setting down his bag and removing his coat. Bancroft and Elliott exchanged glances. "It's the girl," Bancroft said finally. "Tabitha. She's changed." The word hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. "Changed how?" Jefferson pressed. "Is she ill? Injured? See for yourself," Elliott whispered, gesturing toward the back room. "But doctor, prepare yourself. What you're about to witness challenges everything we thought we knew about God's creation." Jefferson had delivered babies during cholera outbreaks, amputated limbs shattered by farm machinery, and sutured wounds that would have killed lesser men. He prided himself on his scientific objectivity and rational approach to even the most disturbing medical cases. But as he walked down the narrow hallway toward Tabitha's room, something deep in his chest began to tighten with an inexplicable dread. The hallway seemed longer than it should have been. The floorboards, which had creaked under his weight moments before, now made no sound at all. And from behind the closed door at the end of the corridor came a sound that raised every hair on his arms, not quite humming, not quite singing, but something that fell in the uncanny valley between human and other. Science had no name for this. But what waited behind that door would force Jefferson to invent one, even as it destroyed everything he thought he knew about the boundaries between life and death, normal and impossible. And in the months that followed, he would discover that Tabitha Parker was not the first case of her kind, nor would she be the last. The door handle turned like ice beneath Jefferson's palm, and the metallic click of the latch seemed to echo longer than physics should allow. Inside Tabitha's room, the smell of carbolic acid gave way to something sweeter, like overripe fruit mixed with the copper tang of fresh pennies. This case would either make Jefferson's career or destroy his sanity, and he suspected both outcomes might be true simultaneously. Tabitha Parker sat upright in her narrow bed, her back pressed against the wooden headboard. At first glance, She appeared to be a normal 14-year-old girl. Brown hair, braided neatly, pale skin, thin frame typical of rural children who worked hard and ate little. But when Jefferson looked closer, the impossible details began to assert themselves with the quiet insistence of a nightmare. Her eyes were open, but they didn't track movement. They stared straight ahead with the glassy fixation of the dead, yet her chest rose and fell in perfect respiratory rhythm. Her lips moved constantly in that strange, not quite humming sound, forming words in no language Jefferson recognized. And her hands, dear God, her hands. When did this begin? Jefferson asked Tabitha Parker, who stood in the corner, wringing a damp cloth between her fingers. 3 days ago, the woman whispered. She was helping me with the washing when she just stopped moving, stopped talking, stopped being my Tabitha, but she's still breathing, still alive. Doctor, what's wrong with my daughter? Jefferson approached the bed slowly, his medical training warring with every primitive instinct screaming at him to flee. He had examined countless patients in various states of consciousness, catatonia, fever, delirium, epileptic seizures, but this was something else entirely. Tabitha's body exhibited signs of life, while simultaneously displaying characteristics that belonged only to the dead. File note, October 14th, 1879. Patient exhibits no response to verbal stimuli, light stimulus, or physical contact. Pulse steady at 72 BPM. Temperature normal. Pupils fixed and dilated. No apparent physical trauma. He reached for her wrist to check her pulse. The moment his fingers made contact with her skin, Tabitha's head snapped toward him with mechanical precision. Her dead eyes looked directly into his, and her lips curved into a smile that contained no warmth, no recognition, no humanity. "Hello, Dr. Jefferson," she said in a voice that was perfectly, terrifyingly normal. "I've been waiting for you." Jefferson jerked his hand back, as if burned. "Tabitha, can you hear me?" "Tabitha isn't here right now," the girl replied, still smiling that empty smile. "But don't worry, she's safe. We're keeping her very safe indeed." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Tabitha Parker began to sob quietly in the corner, while Bancroft muttered a prayer under his breath. Jefferson forced himself to maintain professional composure, but his hands trembled as he reached for his stethoscope. "Who is we?" he asked, keeping his voice level. "The others, of course. The ones who came before. The ones who are coming after." Tabitha tilted her head at an angle no living person could achieve without snapping their cervical vertebrae. "Would you like to meet them, Doctor? They're very excited to make your acquaintance." Before Jefferson could respond, Tabitha's body went rigid. Her back arched off the bed, her limbs locked in positions that defied anatomy, and from her throat came a sound that belonged in no human vocal range, a harmonic frequency that seemed to resonate in the bones themselves. Then, as suddenly as it began, the episode ended. Tabitha collapsed back onto the mattress, breathing normally, her eyes once again vacant and staring. But scratched into the wooden headboard behind her, as if carved by invisible fingernails, were symbols that Jefferson had never seen before. The girl was a doorway. What was walking through it? And why had it chosen this isolated Kentucky farmhouse as its point of entry into the world? Benedict Northcott's telegram arrived at Jefferson's office exactly 72 hours after the first examination, the ink still wet with urgency and something that looked suspiciously like dried blood. The message was brief. "Another case. Come immediately. Bring restraints." The pattern was beginning to reveal itself, and Jefferson realized he was no longer dealing with an isolated medical anomaly. He was witnessing an epidemic of the impossible. Northcott served as the circuit physician for 3 counties, covering territory that stretched from the Tennessee border to the Ohio River. If he was requesting restraints, the situation had escalated beyond anything Jefferson's traditional medical training could address. The 2-day ride to Northcott's practice in Millfield gave Jefferson time to study his notes from the Parker case, looking for clues that might explain what was happening to these children. Medical journal entry, October 17th, 1879. Patient continues to exhibit dual consciousness. Primary personality absent during episodes. Secondary entity demonstrates knowledge of events and individuals unknown to patient. Physical anomalies include impossible joint flexibility and resistance to pain stimuli. The autumn landscape blurred past Jefferson's horse as he pushed toward Millfield. Farmers working their fields looked up as he passed, their faces carrying the weight of whispered rumors. Word traveled fast in rural communities, especially when that word carried implications that challenged the natural order. Agnes Marshall had been experiencing episodes for 5 days when Jefferson arrived at Northcott's clinic. Unlike Tabitha Parker, Agnes was only 9 years old, the daughter of a prosperous merchant family. She had shown no previous signs of illness or unusual behavior until the morning she failed to wake up, or rather, until something else woke up in her place. The similarities are undeniable, Northcott explained as they stood outside Agnes's room. Complete personality displacement during episodes, knowledge of information the child couldn't possibly possess, and the physical manifestations. He gestured helplessly. Jefferson, I've been practicing medicine for 30 years. I've seen cholera, consumption, yellow fever. I've never seen anything like this. Through the door, they could hear Agnes singing in a voice that carried harmonics impossible for a 9-year-old throat to produce. The melody was haunting, beautiful, and completely wrong. How many others? Jefferson asked. 4 confirmed cases in my territory, possibly more that haven't been reported. Northcott's hands shook as he lit his pipe. All children between the ages of 8 and 15, all exhibiting identical symptoms. And Jefferson, they're spreading. The weight of that revelation settled like lead in Jefferson's stomach. If this was spreading, if it was somehow contagious, then they were facing something far worse than isolated medical mysteries. They were looking at the possibility of an entirely new category of human condition, one that defied every principle of medical science. Inside Agnes's room, the singing stopped, abruptly. A child's voice called out, "Dr. Northcott? The new doctor is here. May we speak with him? We have so much to tell him about what's coming. What if they weren't victims at all?" Jefferson reached for the door handle, knowing that whatever he discovered on the other side would fundamentally change his understanding of medicine, consciousness, and the fragile boundaries between the living and the dead. But first, he needed to ask himself the question that had been haunting him since leaving the Parker house. What if these children weren't being possessed by something external, but were instead transforming into something humanity had never encountered before? The town meeting in Ashworth's Hollow convened on a Thursday evening in late October, 1879. But the real gathering had been happening in hushed conversations for weeks before that. Around kitchen tables and general store counters, the good people of the community had been perfecting the art of willful blindness. When a small town decides to ignore the impossible, the conspiracy of silence becomes more powerful than any truth science might offer. Jefferson had returned from Millfield with documentation of 7 confirmed cases across 3 counties. The pattern was undeniable. Healthy children falling into catatonic states, then displaying knowledge and abilities that belonged to no 14-year-old farm girl or 9-year-old merchant's son. But when he stood before the assembled townspeople in the whitewashed meeting hall, he faced something far more disturbing than unexplained medical phenomena. He faced a community determined to remain ignorant. "Folks are talking nonsense," declared Merrick Ashworth, the town's founder's grandson and unofficial leader. "These children are suffering from fever dreams. Nothing more. Dr. Jefferson, with respect, perhaps your inexperience is leading you to dramatic conclusions." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Jefferson noticed how carefully people avoided looking directly at Fidelia Parker, who sat alone in the back row, her hands folded in her lap. Tabitha had been confined to her room for 2 weeks now, and the sounds that emerged from the Parker house at night had forced several neighbors to relocate their families. "I've documented physical evidence," Jefferson insisted, holding up his medical journal. Symbols carved into wood by hands that showed no sign of injury. Vocal patterns that exceed human physiological capabilities. "These children know things they couldn't possibly know." "Children have active imaginations," interrupted Winifred Fitzgerald, the school headmistress, "especially when they're ill. Why, just last year, little Tommy Stevens claimed he could speak to his dead grandfather during a bout of scarlet fever." The comparison was absurd, and everyone in the room knew it. Tommy Stevens had been delirious with high fever. These children exhibited normal body temperature and vital signs during their episodes. But Jefferson was beginning to understand that facts meant nothing when a community had decided that ignorance was safer than knowledge. Pastor Elliott stood slowly, his weathered Bible clutched against his chest. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "we should consider that some mysteries are not meant for human understanding. The Lord works in ways beyond our comprehension. Medical records don't lie. But people do," Jefferson realized, as he watched faces turn away from him throughout the room. They lie to themselves, most effectively of all. Merrick Lockwood, the town's miller, raised his hand. "What exactly are you suggesting we do, Doctor? Lock up every child who has a nightmare? These families have been through enough without your wild theories, making things worse." "I'm suggesting we investigate," Jefferson replied. "I'm suggesting we document what's happening and try to understand it before it spreads further." The silence that followed was deafening. Then, Theodora Jefferson, no relation, despite the shared name, spoke from her seat near the front. "My cousin lives over in Millfield. She says Dr. Northcott has been telling similar stories. But you know what else she says? She says those families have been ostracized. Can't sell their crops. Can't get credit at the stores. People cross the street to avoid them." The message was clear. Investigating meant isolation. Understanding meant economic and social destruction. In a community where survival depended on mutual cooperation, asking questions had become a luxury no one could afford. "Motion to table this discussion indefinitely," Ashworth announced. "All in favor?" Every hand in the room went up except Jefferson's. Even Fidelia Parker, whose daughter was trapped in some unknowable condition, raised her trembling hand to vote for willful ignorance. As the meeting dispersed, Jefferson remained in his seat, watching neighbors file past without meeting his eyes. Outside, children's voices carried on the evening air. Normal laughter, normal play. But underneath those familiar sounds, if you listened carefully, you could hear something else. A humming that didn't quite match any melody known to human ears. The town had chosen blindness. But blindness doesn't make monsters disappear. It only makes them bolder, hungrier, and infinitely more dangerous when they finally reveal themselves. The official letter arrived on November 2nd, 1879, bearing the seal of the United States Public Health Service and a directive that made Jefferson's blood run cold. All cases of unexplained neurological anomalies in minors must be reported immediately to federal authorities. Someone in Washington had been paying attention to the scattered reports filtering up from rural Kentucky, and Jefferson realized his small-town medical mystery had just become a matter of national security. The letter was signed by Dr. Mahlon Long, Chief Medical Officer for the newly established Division of Epidemic Intelligence. Jefferson had heard Long's name whispered in medical circles, a brilliant physician who had made his reputation studying cholera outbreaks in New York's tenements, then disappeared into government service after publishing papers on non-traditional disease vectors that the medical establishment had deemed too controversial for mainstream journals. Federal Directive 847A. Cases involving apparent consciousness displacement, abnormal physical capabilities, or knowledge acquisition beyond subject's background require immediate quarantine and federal oversight. 3 days after receiving the letter, Jefferson found himself face to face with Long himself in the makeshift laboratory that had been established in Ashworth's Hollow's abandoned grain warehouse. The federal presence had transformed the sleepy farming community overnight. Military wagons rolled through Main Street, telegraph lines were installed, and armed guards now stood at strategic positions throughout the town. "Dr. Jefferson," Long said without preamble, his pale eyes scanning Jefferson's medical notes with mechanical precision. "Your documentation is thorough, but incomplete. We need to understand the vector." "Vector?" Jefferson asked. "Sir, I'm not certain we're dealing with a traditional disease." Long's smile was thin and sharp. "Everything spreads somehow, Doctor. The question is whether it's biological, environmental, or—" He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "Something else entirely." The federal team had brought equipment Jefferson had never seen before: electromagnetic measurement devices, photographic apparatus designed to capture images in complete darkness, and recording cylinders that could preserve the strange vocalizations the children produced during their episodes. But more disturbing than the technology was the team's clear familiarity with cases like these. "How many other locations?" Jefferson asked as they prepared to examine Tabitha Parker under controlled conditions. 17 confirmed sites across 8 states. Long replied matter-of-factly. The pattern began appearing in 1877 in rural Montana. It's been moving east ever since. The revelation hit Jefferson like a physical blow. This wasn't an isolated outbreak. It was part of something much larger, something that had been systematically spreading across the American frontier for over 2 years. And if the government had been tracking it for that long, why hadn't they developed any effective treatments? Case file 847A17. Subject demonstrates ability to vocalize in frequency ranges measuring 23,187 Hz, well below normal human vocal capability. Knowledge displayed during episodes includes geographic information, historical events, and personal details of individual subject has never encountered. As they entered the Parker house, Jefferson noticed how the federal guards positioned themselves not to keep people out, but to keep something in. The implications made his stomach turn. These children weren't just patients, they were prisoners. Tabitha sat in her usual position, back straight against the headboard, eyes fixed on some invisible horizon. But when Long entered the room, her head turned with that unnatural mechanical precision, and her lips curved into that familiar, terrifying smile. "Dr. Long," she said in her perfectly normal voice, "we've been expecting you. The others are so pleased you finally decided to visit." Long showed no surprise, no fear, only clinical interest. "How many others?" he asked calmly. "More than you know, fewer than you fear." Tabitha's head tilted at that impossible angle. "But don't worry, Doctor. Soon you'll meet them all." The recording cylinders captured every word, every impossible vocalization. The electromagnetic devices registered readings that defied explanation. And Jefferson began to understand that the federal government wasn't here to cure these children. They were here to study them. But what were they planning to do with what they learned? And why did Jefferson suddenly feel like he had been recruited, not as a doctor, but as an unwitting collaborator in something far more sinister than medical research? The screaming began at 2:37 a.m. on November 15, 1879, but it wasn't coming from any of the afflicted children. It was coming from Dr. Mahlon Long's private laboratory tent, and it sounded distinctly like a grown man discovering the true cost of his curiosity. What Jefferson witnessed that night would force him to confront a terrible question. When does scientific advancement become scientific atrocity? The federal encampment had grown to encompass half of Ashworth's Hollow. Military personnel moved between canvas structures with the efficiency of a war operation, while townspeople huddled in their homes, forbidden from approaching the quarantine zone. Jefferson had been granted limited access as the local medical liaison, but even he wasn't allowed into Long's private research facility until the screaming started. Guard protocols collapsed in the face of genuine emergency. Jefferson pushed through the tent flaps to find Long, strapped to an examination table identical to those used for the children. His eyes rolled back, his body convulsing in patterns that mirrored exactly what they had observed in the young patients. But Long was 43 years old, well beyond the age range that had previously been affected. "What happened?" Jefferson demanded, grabbing the nearest technician. "He was conducting direct contact experiments," the man stammered. "Extended physical contact with subject 17. He insisted on maintaining connection despite the readings." Another scream cut through the explanation. Long's back arched off the table, and when he spoke, his voice carried the same impossible harmonics they had documented in the children. "Dr. Jefferson," Long said, though his eyes remained vacant. "How wonderful that you could join us. Dr. Long has been such an eager student. He learned so much before his mind broke." Research note, November 15th, 1879. Adult subject demonstrates identical symptomatology to juvenile cases following direct neural contact experiment. Consciousness displacement appears complete. Original personality shows no signs of recovery. Jefferson backed toward the tent opening, but the thing wearing Long's face turned to follow his movement. "Where are you going, doctor? Don't you want to understand? Isn't knowledge what you've been seeking?" The technicians worked frantically to adjust their instruments, recording every impossible sound, every physiological anomaly. Jefferson realized with growing horror that this hadn't been an accident. It had been planned. Long had deliberately exposed himself to whatever was affecting the children, turning himself into a test subject for his own research. "The children," Jefferson whispered. "What are you doing to them?" "Teaching them," Long's voice replied, though the smile on his face belonged to something else entirely. "Preparing them. Every consciousness that joins us makes the process easier for the next. Soon, there will be enough of us, too." Long's body convulsed again, more violently than before. When the episode ended, he was unconscious, his vital signs barely detectable. But the recording equipment showed readings that defied every principle of medical science. They weren't being possessed. Jefferson stumbled from the tent with a realization that made his hands shake. The children weren't victims of some external force. They were being transformed into something else, something that required human consciousness as raw material. And the federal research wasn't aimed at curing them. It was aimed at understanding how to control the process. Outside, Grover Dalton, Long's second in command, was already issuing orders to pack the equipment. "We're moving the operation," he announced. "Dr. Long's research has provided the breakthrough we needed." "Breakthrough?" Jefferson grabbed Dalton's arm. "The man's consciousness has been completely displaced." Dalton's smile was cold and clinical. "Exactly. We now have proof that the process can be replicated in adult subjects. The applications for intelligence gathering alone." Jefferson's blood turned to ice. They weren't trying to cure the children. They were trying to weaponize whatever was happening to them. As the federal convoy prepared to leave Ashworth's Hollow, taking their equipment and their test subjects with them, Jefferson faced a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Remain silent and complicit, or speak out and risk becoming the next subject in their impossible experiments. The price of knowledge was too high. But in a world where the government had already decided that some sacrifices were acceptable in the name of progress, one country doctor's moral objections might not be enough to stop what had already been set in motion. Dolly Sutherland was the first to remember her own name while the thing inside her was speaking, and that small act of resistance, on December 3rd, 1879, changed everything the federal researchers thought they understood about consciousness, identity, and the war being fought inside these children's minds. The battle for human souls, it turned out, was not as one-sided as the government scientists had believed. Jefferson had followed the federal convoy to their new facility in Louisville, driven by a combination of professional obligation and personal guilt. The converted military hospital housed 17 children now, each one monitored around the clock by teams of researchers who treated them more like scientific specimens than human beings. But within the sterile walls and clinical documentation, something unexpected was beginning to happen. The children were fighting back. It started with small things, explained Nellie Ashworth, the one nurse who had shown genuine compassion for the young patients. A flicker of recognition when we called their names. Tears during the episodes. Yesterday, little Effie Lawrence asked for her mother while that thing was speaking through her mouth. Jefferson studied the latest reports with growing amazement. The federal team had assumed the original personalities were completely suppressed during episodes, but careful observation revealed moments of overlap seconds when both consciousnesses seemed to be present simultaneously. Clinical observation, EST, December 20, 1879. Subject 12 displayed apparent dual awareness during vocalization episode. Requested water in normal voice while maintaining impossible vocal frequency patterns. Suggests original personality remains accessible despite apparent displacement. Dolly Sutherland's breakthrough came during a routine examination. The 11-year-old farmer's daughter had been catatonic for 6 weeks, speaking only in the harmonious, impossible voice that had become horrifyingly familiar to the research staff. But as Dr. Grover Dalton prepared to begin another round of consciousness mapping experiments, something unprecedented occurred. "My name is Dolly Sutherland," the girl said clearly, her voice entirely her own. "I live on Maple Creek Road with my papa and my 2 brothers, and I want to go home." The monitoring equipment went haywire. Electromagnetic readings spiked beyond measurement range. Recording cylinders captured 2 distinct vocal patterns occurring simultaneously, the girl's normal speech overlaying the impossible harmonic frequencies that had defined her condition. Dalton rushed to restrain her, but Dolly turned to look directly at Jefferson with eyes that were fully aware, fully present. "Doctor," she said urgently, "they're not taking us over. They're trying to make us forget who we are, but we can remember. We just have to fight to remember. Consciousness isn't passive." The revelation rippled through the facility like an earthquake. If the children could maintain awareness during episodes, if they could resist whatever was attempting to displace their identities, then everything the federal team had theorized about the condition was wrong. Within hours, 3 more children began demonstrating similar resistance. Virden Vanderbilt, a 13-year-old from Tennessee, managed to speak his own name during an episode that had lasted for 48 hours. Lydia Vanderbilt, his younger sister, began crying real tears while the entity inside her continued its impossible vocalizations. "This changes everything," Jefferson told Dalton that evening. "These children aren't lost. They're prisoners in their own bodies, but they're still fighting." Dalton's response was swift and chilling. "Then we need to understand how to prevent that resistance. Full consciousness displacement is essential for practical applications." The casual brutality of the statement hit Jefferson like a physical blow. The federal team wasn't interested in helping the children remember themselves. They were interested in making sure future subjects couldn't resist at all. That night, as Jefferson walked the hospital corridors, he could hear whispers coming from the children's rooms. Not the impossible harmonics that had defined their condition, but actual whispers, fragments of memory, snatches of identity, the quiet rebellion of young minds refusing to surrender to whatever was trying to consume them. "We remember," came Dolly's voice through her door. "We remember who we are, but would remembering be enough?" As federal researchers worked frantically to understand and suppress the children's newfound resistance, Jefferson realized he was witnessing something far more significant than a medical breakthrough. He was watching the first battle in a war between human consciousness and something that wanted to replace it entirely. And the fate of every child in that facility might depend on which side won. The explosion that shattered the Louisville facility at exactly 9:43 p.m. on December 21st, 1879, lit the winter sky like a second sun and marked the moment when Dr. Thaddeus Jefferson stopped being a passive observer and became something far more dangerous to the federal operation. This was the night when medical ethics collided with government expediency, and only one could survive the impact. Jefferson had been planning the sabotage for 18 days, ever since he discovered the federal team's true intentions hidden in classified documents left carelessly unguarded. The children's growing resistance hadn't prompted research into helping them recover. It had accelerated plans to develop consciousness suppression protocols for use in intelligence operations. The young patients weren't being studied for their own benefit. They were being used to perfect techniques that would allow the government to create controllable, displaced human assets. The plan was deceptively simple. The facility's electrical systems, hastily installed in the converted military hospital, had numerous vulnerabilities that a careful observer could exploit. A series of calculated overloads, timed to coincide with the evening shift change, would disable the monitoring equipment and create enough chaos for the children to escape. What Jefferson hadn't anticipated was that he wouldn't be working alone. Dr. Jefferson, came Dolly Sutherland's voice through the darkness as he worked to disable the primary electrical panel. "We've been waiting for you." He turned to find 7 children standing in the corridor behind him, their eyes clear and present, their movements entirely their own. Somehow, their growing resistance had culminated in complete temporary recovery of their normal consciousness. "How long do we have?" asked Effie Lawrence, the youngest at only 8 years old, her voice steady despite her age. "Minutes, maybe less," Jefferson replied, his hands still working on the electrical connections. "Can you maintain control?" "Long enough," said Verdon Vanderbilt grimly. "But they're getting stronger. The things inside us. We can feel them pushing back." Time was running out. Jefferson led the children through maintenance corridors he had memorized during his weeks of observation. Behind them, the facility erupted into controlled chaos as electrical systems failed throughout the building. Emergency lighting flickered on, then died. Alarms that should have sounded remained silent. They reached the service exit just as the first explosion rocked the building. Jefferson had calculated the electrical overload, precisely enough damage to destroy research equipment and records, not enough to seriously injure the staff. But as they emerged into the December night, he realized the children had added their own contribution to the destruction. "We told them the truth," Dolly explained as they watched flames consume the research wing. "The things that were trying to take us over. We told them exactly what the government planned to do with what they learned from us." The second explosion was far larger than anything Jefferson had planned. The entire east wing of the facility vanished in a pillar of fire that reached toward the stars, taking with it decades of research into consciousness manipulation and human experimentation. "They didn't like being used either," Effie added with the matter-of-fact tone that only children could achieve when discussing the impossible. As military personnel rushed to contain the fires and account for missing subjects, Jefferson led the children into the winter darkness beyond Louisville. They had perhaps an hour before the manhunt began, maybe 2 before federal agents tracked them down. "Where will you go?" he asked as they reached the tree line. "Home," said Verdon simply. "We remember who we are now, really remember. That makes us stronger than whatever was trying to replace us." One by one, the children melted into the darkness, each heading toward family, toward identity, toward the lives that government science had tried to steal from them. Jefferson watched until the last small figure disappeared among the trees, then turned back toward the burning facility. His own escape would be harder. Federal agents would be looking for the doctor who had helped 17 test subjects vanish into the Kentucky wilderness. But as he walked toward an uncertain future, Jefferson carried something more valuable than his own safety: the knowledge that human consciousness, when properly motivated, could resist even the most sophisticated attempts at displacement. Some fires burned clean. The federal facility continued to burn through the night, taking with it the research that might have changed the nature of human identity forever. And deep in the Kentucky mountains, local storytellers still speak of the winter when 17 children walked out of the darkness, remembering their own names and warning others never to trust government doctors who ask too many questions about consciousness and the spaces between thoughts. The final government report on the Louisville incident, filed 3 months after the facility burned, contained exactly 47 pages of meticulous documentation and one sentence that revealed everything the federal investigation had failed to understand. Subjects remain unlocated despite extensive search operations. 17 children had simply vanished into the American frontier, taking with them secrets that would haunt government researchers for generations to come. Dr. Thaddeus Jefferson never practiced medicine again. The man who had once believed that science could explain everything human spent his remaining years as a traveling preacher, moving from town to town across the Ohio Valley, with a message that confused congregations and terrified medical professionals. Some mysteries were meant to remain unsolved, and some knowledge came at too high a price for human souls to pay. His final journal, discovered after his death in 1894, contained detailed observations of the children he had helped escape. Dolly Sutherland had returned to her family farm and lived a completely normal life, marrying a local blacksmith and raising 4 children of her own. Effie Lawrence became a schoolteacher in Tennessee, known for her unusual ability to help troubled students find their way back to themselves. Verdon and Lydia Vanderbilt disappeared entirely from public records, though mountain folk occasionally reported seeing 2 figures who never seemed to age walking the high country trails. The government never stopped looking. Secret files from the Division of Epidemic Intelligence, declassified nearly a century later, revealed the true scope of what had been lost in the Louisville fire. The consciousness displacement research hadn't been abandoned. It had been driven deeper underground, funded through black budgets, and conducted in facilities so secret their locations were known only to a handful of officials. But without the original subjects, without the children who had learned to resist and remember, the research never progressed beyond theoretical frameworks. Every attempt to replicate the Kentucky cases failed. Adult subjects either died during exposure attempts or suffered complete mental breakdown without achieving the dual consciousness state that had made the children so valuable. The federal researchers had discovered something unprecedented about human development: the flexibility of consciousness that allowed the displacement phenomenon existed only in minds that were still forming, still learning what it meant to be human. And once those children learned to fight back, to remember themselves completely, they became immune to further attempts at consciousness manipulation. In the decades that followed, scattered reports continued to surface. A strange child in Montana who spoke in impossible harmonics until her grandmother taught her to sing hymns. Twin boys in Ohio whose shared consciousness episodes ended when their parents refused to let government doctors examine them. A girl in Texas who learned to lock her mind so thoroughly against intrusion that she became legendary among local psychic investigators. Medical Journal Entry, NDS, Final Addendum, 1894. The human mind, when properly anchored in identity and memory, appears capable of resisting any external attempt at consciousness displacement. The key lies not in the strength of the invasion, but in the strength of the self. Jefferson's final years were spent documenting a different kind of research: the power of human identity to resist forces that sought to reshape it. He corresponded secretly with other physicians who had encountered similar cases, building a network of medical professionals dedicated to protecting rather than exploiting consciousness anomalies. The Kentucky children, grown into adults by then, occasionally sent coded messages confirming they remained themselves, remained free. Their success had apparently created some form of immunity that could be taught to others facing similar threats. Knowledge that started as government experimentation had been transformed into protection for the vulnerable. But the most chilling discovery in Jefferson's final papers was a map marking locations where similar incidents had been reported in the years following Louisville. The pattern suggested that whatever had initially triggered the consciousness displacement phenomenon was still active, still seeking suitable hosts, still moving across the American landscape like a slow, patient infection. Some doors, once opened, never fully close. Modern psychiatric facilities occasionally report cases that echo the 1879 incidents. Children who speak in voices not their own, who demonstrate knowledge beyond their years, who seem to be fighting invisible battles for control of their own minds. But medical science has learned to classify such cases as dissociative disorders, trauma responses, or elaborate hoaxes, anything except what Jefferson suspected them to actually represent. The girl that science forbade to name had given her name back to herself, along with 16 others who learned that memory was more powerful than any force that sought to erase it. But in laboratories hidden from public view, researchers still seek to understand consciousness displacement, still dream of controllable human assets, still believe that some knowledge justifies any price. And sometimes, late at night, in rural hospitals across America, medical staff report children who hum in harmonies that human throats shouldn't be able to produce, children who are learning one by one to remember exactly who they are. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.